Krista?
Thank you, Jimmy. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another edition of CANTO Conversations. While banks may not have been hit by the novel coronavirus as directly as other retail institutions, they do, however, face a pivotal moment as they sit at the heart of the economy and provide funding to businesses and individuals alike. Across the region, tens of thousands of consumers have been placed under lockdown, and in some cases, many have lost their ability to pay for credit, particularly mortgages. The same can be said for businesses with loans at risk due to forced shutdowns. Most banks will now be in full business continuity mode, and they are now required in this difficult period of uncertainty to strike the balance between upholding the highest standards of customer service and security, which existed in a pre-COVID period, whilst prioritizing the care of banking employees in the midst of this extremely uncertain pandemic. Undoubtedly, the banking sector's uninterrupted stability is critical in keeping the economic system up and running. In today's edition of CANTO Conversations, we will discuss the role of banking as a critical player both now and in the post-pandemic time, and how we can rely on actions taken in the sector to significantly moderate the economic damage that this crisis could potentially inflict. What are some of the sustainable changes we should expect? And what will be the new reality for the banking sector in the region and perhaps the world at large? We are privileged to have as our guest today, Ms. Wendy Delmar. Wendy is the Chief Executive Officer of the Caribbean Association of Banks, a pan-Caribbean organization committed to serving the needs of over 80 members and partners in more than 20 territories. Vision focused on being the collective voice that protects, promotes, and strengthens the regional banking sector, Wendy and her able-bodied team maintain high involvement with the bankers' associations of the region and have their fingers on the pulse of regional, international, and global developments, acting as a veritable pacemaker for reform in the regional banking sector. Wendy brings over 20 years of experience in mainstream banking to the leadership of the Caribbean Association of Banks. With a passion for training and developing human capital, Ms. Delmar currently holds an MSc in Global Human Resource Management, which she believes deepens her passion for nurturing growth with the people she encounters daily. Ladies and gentlemen, I am your host, Krista Leith, and in this edition of CANTO Conversations, I present to you the CEO of the Caribbean Association of Banks, Ms. Wendy Delmar. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Krista, for such a lovely and warm introduction to the team. It is indeed an absolute pleasure and an honor to address you again this morning, having had an opportunity to interface with your team in Cuba in January, early February. So it really is it's wonderful to be here. Unfortunate the circumstances, but still we're really happy to be able to share with you. And as you rightly said, Krista, this is an unprecedented time, not only for the banking system, but generally for our region and the Caribbean, and indeed more widespread in terms of a global impact, something that we have not seen, I think, since perhaps the 1960s, when we looked at the massive impact of the flu. So today, my responsibility really is to walk you through the Caribbean banking's response to COVID and to give you a little bit of an insight into some of the things that we continue to do to try to ensure that everyone is able to come through this with as little scarring as is possible. So how has the Caribbean governments generally responded to the crisis? We've seen throughout the region a number of implementations having taken place, including, but not limited to, the closure of all educational institutions reliant on physical or face-to-face instruction. We've also seen robust training of medical personnel to effectively manage the treatment of COVID. We have seen enforcement of national curfews, I think this would have been one of the more difficult to swallow for a lot of our people, noting that we are very warm people who are used to frequenting each other's homes, family homes, and so on. And so I think this particular measure of abstinence, so to speak, would have been one of the more difficult ones for a lot of us to have adjusted to. We would have seen scaling down of the economic activity to that of essential services. And I think certainly in a lot of instances, banking may not have previously been considered an essential service, particularly given the predominance of, or the desire to migrate a lot of customers from face-to-face banking to online services. And I'll pause here just for a second to say that while historically we would have seen persons really pushing back against using online services, I would have had numerous conversations from my previous role in core banking with persons who said, boy, I can't understand why I did not do this sooner. And so it speaks to the adaptability of persons in times of crisis to really move forward. And so I think that while COVID has undeniably had a disastrous impact on the economies, it certainly has brought tremendous opportunities to the fore as well. And for that, I say kudos to our Caribbean people for being able to in a very efficient and effective manner, make the necessary adaptations to ensure our safety as a people. In our little prelude, when we spoke briefly this morning, we celebrated that we are now 8 countries COVID-free, or 8 islands COVID-free. And in the grand scale of the bigger picture, that is certainly something that we have to be very proud of as a people. We would have seen also the closure of national borders, with the exception of trade in goods and via air and seaports. And we would have also seen a significant amount of public sensitization with regards to COVID. It was very heartening for me as well to have received a call from a partner in Canada, whom I would have met in October of last year, asking that I be featured in an advertisement that he was doing, and he wanted global faces. And that was specifically around sensitizing children to the whole conversation of this virus and the steps that we needed to take in terms of washing our hands to stay COVID-free. So it's really good to see that in the face of challenge and crisis, we have been able to, not only as a region, but as one united world, come together to put certain measures in place to ensure that we are able to come out of it with as much efficiency as possible, if that is even possible. So specifically, how has the Caribbean banking and financial services industry responded? And there have been a number of initiatives that have taken place. While I don't want to sound in any way, shape, or form biased, I must, in saying kudos to the banking sector. I think in the midst of all of the disruption that COVID brought, the banking sector was able to come together very, very quickly in response to this whole dynamic and say, how do we play an efficient and effective part in getting our people through this? So at present, the overarching priority of the banks had been to provide support to current customers and clients alike. And that is not only to say individual clients and business houses, but certainly the governments who are leading the charge with this otherwise disastrous pandemic. As the situation continues to develop, there would be a further assessment as we move forward to determine how best do we continue to provide support to our members, to our partners, and more broadly speaking. But the first things that would have been done would have been, for example, to offer loan repayment moratoriums for 3 to 6 month periods. We were able to get on calls with the ECCB, for example, bringing in government ministers and leaders to say, you know, given that we are operating in a highly regulated environment, how do we put our best foot forward while remaining positive, staying on top of the regulations that guide us, to ensure that we can put something out there that will help persons to recover quickly. There was a significant amount of public sensitization as well with regards to online banking. And a lot of the individual banks who would normally operate in a highly competitive environment were able to come together through their associations and get a lot of these initiatives underway. So again, kudos to our Caribbean people for being able to work together in the face of COVID to ensure that we were able to put our best foot forward and put the offerings out there to our consumers as well to show our support. During the 24-hour shutdowns, I know that a lot of institutions would have had to have staff on call. So for example, in the past, one of the things we would have heard is the ATMs are always down. And the staff members were able to say, despite the threat to me personally as an individual, I will still come in to assist in replenishing ATMs to ensure that the service is not hampered. And so the banking sector has really, really retained its focus on ensuring that our customers are able to access monies where needed. There would have been a lot of laughter, to put it mildly, about, well, why the banking sector? If we're on 24-hour curfew, why do we need money? But there are persons who would have needed medical supplies. There are persons who may have needed to go to hospitals. And so there's a lot of learning that would have come out of this experience for us as well. And not only from a health pandemic or from a health issue, but certainly as we begin to make our strides into the hurricane season, what are some of the things that we need to keep top of mind? So for example, if we know that there are hurricane warnings, we oftentimes speak about the fact that we need to safeguard passports and other legal documents. Money is also something that we need to be able to put aside in Ziploc bags to ensure that we have immediate access should something go wrong. We also would have seen the introduction of new online services, and perhaps in a lot of instances, not just new services, but again, because of sensitization, persons would have recognized the extent of the online offering that a lot of their banks do presently provide to them. So for example, the ability to transfer monies across banks, across institutions, is something that a lot of people were able to herald and say congratulations, but these are things that have been in place, at least in certain institutions, for quite some time now. We heard a lot of talk as well about the persons who would have been paid salaries, your home help, your gardeners. I think also there was a heightened sense of awareness for those persons who often say that we don't need a bank account. That in cases like this, in instances like this, life did not have to come to a grinding halt from a financial perspective. It just means that we need to constantly remain vigilant and on top of our personal needs and challenges, and to have those interactions with your banks to ensure that you are receiving the fullest benefit of being a member of an institution such as your financial institutions. We would have also seen coming out of, making strides towards coming out of the COVID pandemic, significant financial donations being posited by a number of our members. We would have seen, for example, Republic Bank would have made a significant financial contribution, First Caribbean Bank. So we would have seen not only the international banks or those who still remain, but we would have also seen indigenous banks making tremendous efforts at providing financial options that would have assisted in bringing the countries themselves out of the financial hardship that they had been facing. Certainly from the CAB's perspective, we have remained very, very active and very visible in providing training opportunities at this critical juncture, noting that we would have moved significantly to working from home, while some, depending on the level that you would have worked within the institution, you may have been consistently engaged throughout this COVID period. Other levels within the institution may not have had the ability to work from home in that structured daily routine. And so we thought it prudent at this point to ensure that persons had the relevant training to ensure that when we come out of this situation, that everyone is ready to run. Because when we come out of it truly, we do need to be in a position where we can take the bulls by the horns and ensure that we continue to move forward in a very positive and efficient manner. So those would have been some of the initial responses by the financial services sector. As far as the more regional and international organizations, for example, ECCB would have reduced its discount rate from 4.5% to 2%, which would have allowed the banks a little bit more latitude in offering, for example, the moratoriums. So as it stands now, and if I could break this down to perhaps the layman's perspective, in order for the banks to be able to lend, the banks must be able to make money. So with the moratoriums being offered by the banks, it means that there is no opportunity to collect payments from what would have been the vast majority of the bank's portfolios. And as we would have continued to hear through discussion, in most of the islands, the tourism sector would have been what fueled a lot of the economic activity on the islands. So in cases like this, for example, the ECCB's ability to reduce percentage points made it more possible for the banks to continue to operate. What we would have seen, for example, there were no layoffs in the banking sector of any of its staff members, despite the fact that for the 2 to 3 month period, the banks would not have been opened for business the way that they normally would from 8 to 2 or 8 to 4. Every employee continued to receive full benefits and full payment, despite the fact that there are no loans being made, in this instance, to persons who would have worked in the tourism or hotel industry sectors. And so this also would speak to the fact that the banks are committed to ensuring that we are supporting the region that we serve. Further, we would have seen that the IMF would have provided approval for financial assistance to select countries, and that continues to have been the situation up until last week, where we saw continuous grants being offered to a number of islands across the region to assist in ensuring continuity going forward. Some of the key areas for concern for the industry at present would have been increased exposure and risk to cybersecurity threats. As you know, transitioning from brick and mortar office type facilities to working from home meant that persons would have been logging in to internet, Wi-Fi from their own home systems and services. This would have posed an increased risk to the financial services sector, and certainly any sector that would have had to make that shift in such a short space of time. And so with the rapid and unprecedented and heavy use of online platforms by staff and customers alike, banking and financial services institutions would have found themselves more greatly exposed to cyber threats and cybersecurity attacks at that stage. At that juncture, it became imperative for banks to beef up their cybersecurity measures to safeguard against misuse of data and information during the crisis. One of our members, for example, would have fallen victim to a cybersecurity attack very early in the game. And to this date, CAB continues to provide support. So for example, this afternoon, we will actually be putting on our own webinar with one of our partners to safeguard against cybersecurity threats and attacks during this COVID period. The Caribbean region continues to be viewed as an area of high risk for money launderers, for example, and for the financing of terrorism, and to a lesser extent, human trafficking. Through the COVID-19 situation, there may have been interruption in the way in which day-to-day business activity was conducted, and it became imperative to give even more consideration and focus to anti-money laundering and CFT regulations. So while the circumstances are indeed trying, any departure from the significant strides made to mitigate against the loss of correspondent banking relations over the period 15 to 18 would be further exacerbated by the challenges of today. So these are real and present circumstances and situations that the banking sector faces. It becomes even more stark reality, for example, in one of the islands where we would have seen a significant spike in ATM fraud during this period. So at every opportunity, we must be mindful that there are persons who are going to try to infiltrate the systems. And so in circumstances like this, it becomes even more, an even greater concern for the banking sector to ensure that we are putting measures in place to safeguard information, customers' information, to safeguard systems, and to safeguard the economies of the islands. Any attack on the financial services sector is a direct impact and attack also on the broader economy. The COVID-19 pandemic has brought to the forefront the benefits and needs for greater inclusion for financial technology in the operations and provisions of services by banks and financial institutions. However, these things come at an additional cost. And the costs, the associated costs accrued during the introductory phase of fintech can indeed be a significantly high one, particularly in the environment that we currently operate, where we have seen the migration of international banks. And what we are seeing now is the emergence or the re-emergence of the indigenous banks who are constantly trying to reinvent themselves to stay ahead of and abreast of and in service of our customers throughout the region. And so the inclusion of the fintech in the industry necessitates the development of the relevant regulatory frameworks. Currently, it is important that the industry strives to maintain low costs as COVID-19 remains highly fluid. We have come out and said we will offer a 3 to 6 month moratorium. However, there is no guarantee for the financial services sector, or more further afield, anyone at this stage, that we would be coming out of the COVID environment. And as we begin to move towards reopening our borders, certainly in the case of St. Lucia, and there is consistent talk about a second wave, what is the impact going to be for the region and, again, by extension, the financial services sector and the economies? Does it mean that if there is a second wave and our borders are open, that we may have to go back to present day where we're seeing curfews and 24-hour shutdowns and scaling back of the economies? And if that is indeed the case, how long will the banks be able to manage non-payment of facilities in order to support the economies? These are some of the real concerns that the banking sector has to be cognizant of. And so we have to ensure that we are pacing what we are doing in terms of serving the public to ensure that if this does indeed become a long-term crisis, that we remain well-positioned, well-funded to continue to support in the way that we have been. The other thing that we need to be very mindful of is the imminent start of the hurricane season. And in the last 10 years, I dare say, we have constantly seen or heard that the hurricane seasons are becoming even more active and destructive, as we would have seen in the case of the Bahamas in 2019. We would have seen in St. Martin in 2018. And so the banking sector also has to be very mindful that on the heels of the moratorium that is being offered, we may very well, God forbid, find ourselves in a situation where we are faced with yet another conundrum from what is predicted to be yet another very active hurricane season in 2020. So these are some of the things that we are constantly mindful of, that we are constantly trying to ensure that our customers, our partners are also very mindful of as we move forward in addressing this COVID environment. What has the CAB's response been to the crisis? Constant engagement with members to provide support and best practices during this time via our websites and social media. One of the things that we launched last month would have been a CAB newsletter, which would have outlined some of the celebration, despite the fact that we are in a very tense environment and there's a lot of uncertainty. There are still fantastic things happening across our banking sector. And we did think it very, very pertinent to continue to say, guys, job well done. Let's keep moving in a positive manner. And like I said, when we started this morning, the Caribbean is doing an exceptional job in terms of being able to ring fence persons who are identified as possibly carrying the threat of the virus. And so we have to keep a very positive mindset as we move forward in spite of the challenges, because at the end of the day, as one Caribbean people, we have proven our resilience time and time again. And I do not think that COVID is going to be any exception or deviation to the norm. The other thing that we have continued to do is to offer live training sessions. Like I mentioned earlier, we are doing something on cyber threats and cybersecurity. And we have also had a number of live engagements, for example, today, where we are educating persons, bringing awareness to visibility to the efforts of the Caribbean banking sector generally, and how we continue to work alongside our partners, the members, and also the region at large to ensure that we maintain what is otherwise considered our fragile economies, particularly from our reliance on correspondent banking, to ensure that we are training our staff, to ensure that we remain on top of regulatory concerns, and to ensure that we continue to advocate for the things that impact the sector and for the general public at large by extension. So I think that pretty much ends my formal presentation, Krista.
Thank you, Wendy, for all that interesting information. I have quite a number of questions that I want to ask myself, and then I will get to the questions that I'm seeing in the Zoom group chat. So, I'm interested in your comment where you stated that during this period, despite the fact that loans weren't being given, there were no layoffs in the banking sector, excuse me, during this period. And that aligns nicely with something that I read recently. There's a McKinsey study that said when the internet was launched, for every one job lost, there were about 2.6 jobs created. So technology tends to have a net positive effect on employment. What we tend to forget sometimes that a baker with a bowl and a spoon who has just acquired an industrialized mixer is still a baker, but with different skills. So my question to you is, did you find that there was a need for you to have to assist your members in quickly reskilling and upskilling their staff in the midst of the pandemic?
It is something that we continue to assess, to be very honest. The Caribbean Association of Banks has undertaken, as part of our advocacy effort actually, to ensure that we advocate through education. We believe that in order for us to move forward in a positive manner, we have to ensure that we know exactly what it is that we are doing. We know what the regulations are. We know what the legal frameworks that we are working within are, the confines that we are working within are. And so we consistently do offer training opportunities to our staff. What we would have found is in order for us to quickly retool and reskill our employees and our staff members generally and broadly, we would have seen all of the partners from Jamaica to Trinidad and the Bahamas, partners that we usually work with, as far-reaching as Florida, offer a number of training opportunities to assist persons in being able to comfortably make this paradigm shift from the norm to what was uncomfortable to what I actually believe now has become so comfortable to most that we are wondering, how do we now transition back into the office? And I say that in the context that where persons may have been hesitant to adopt the technologies of Zoom, like we're doing now, we're seeing a significant increase in the number of requests that we have had. And so we continue to work alongside our team. This morning, just before this session, actually, we were looking at a menu of training options that we are going to be offering to our members. Additionally, noting that there has been a significant increase in requests for training, we are also working alongside all of our partners to see whether or not we can simply put before our members a training menu that they can determine what's best and what's a right fit for them at the time. In the past, we would have made the decision for our members and said, okay, so this is what we think you need now. But truly, this has presented significant opportunities. And so persons are taking the lead, so to speak, to say that during this time of change, here are some of the things that we need to assist our staff, our internal partners, to be more ready for the changes that are still to come.
Thank you, Wendy. So I'm going to go into our group chat and take one question from there. I'm not going to hug you all to myself. So Colin wants to know, what efforts will be made by regional banks to make digital payment methods, example, credit cards, more widely available and accessible for people across the region? And again, I'll repeat it, what efforts will be made by regional banks to make digital payment methods more widely available and accessible for people across the region?
Great. Hi, Colin. Good morning, and thank you for that question. It's a really good one, and I'm happy that you asked. As a matter of fact, One of the things that the ECCB is currently working on, and the CAB is also going to be providing a white paper to support the effort, is a regional an RTGS, which is a real-time gross settlement system, so that we are able to answer to exactly that. Of course, initiatives such as these require some measure of testing. We have been able to identify a couple of the islands, the bigger islands, who have some semblance of a regional gross, real-time gross settlement system already in place. However, we are challenged in that as a region, we do have different currencies. So for example, we have Trinidad with their Trinidad dollar, we have Jamaica, we have Barbados. What we need to ensure is that we work through these kinks so that when we do come to market, we have a seamless process already in place for you. That said, there are a couple institutions within the region who are able to facilitate one-off payments across the islands. And so what I would really strongly recommend to those persons on the call and out there in our cyber world listening in today is speak with your financial services representative and see what options truly exist for you. Some of us are very familiar with our online transfers. We can do our own payments within country, within bank. But in a lot of instances, there are more features available to you today, at present, that you can begin to explore. So have the conversations and see whether or not your institution is already online and able to offer that to you. Those are some of the wonderful things that COVID was able to expose. And so a lot of persons were able to understand exactly how much their banks do offer that they had not taken advantage of in the past. So go ahead and explore.
Thank you very much for that, Wendy. I'm going to piggyback on that question a little bit. Can you share with us any information with regard to the penetration level of electronic banking and online payment region-wide? And how does that affect readiness for a situation such as the situation we're in today with regard to COVID? Thank you.
Unfortunately, I don't have at hand penetration figures. However, suffice it to say, what we have seen is persons may not be aware of the full gamut of options that are available through online services. So for example, we would see a significantly higher number of individuals using online services. And we would see perhaps significantly less number using online services from a small business, particularly from a small business perspective, not so much corporate. Corporate and individual, we tend to see a lot of dynamic transactions. However, for small businesses, we tend to see persons saying that they really prefer to come into the bank and have a conversation. They want to see their money go into their accounts. This is a tremendously fantastic, I sound like one of the presidents whose name I will not mention, tremendously fantastic opportunity, again, for our small business partners and generally persons to go in and find out exactly what is capable, what is possible using their online facilities. So for example, the more common transactions would be things like wire transfers that persons do not realize they can actually do online. If not online, there is an online component where you can complete the forms, for example, and send it in without having to go in to face your bank. And that is one of the things that the banks have truly tried to ensure that they are sensitizing the public to during this COVID period, during this COVID episode, to ensure that persons understand that time truly is money. And the banks really are making every effort to ensure that the services are there to match the needs of the client, particularly in cases like this. So again, perhaps it is something that we can revert to you on, Krista, so that you can share more broadly with your audience to provide you some empirical information. But there is still tremendous opportunity for us to engage our clients and customers to ensure that they're getting the best out of the services that are available across the board.
Thank you for that very comprehensive answer, Wendy. I'm going to take another question from the group chat. We have Mr. Albert Daniels. And Mr. Daniels wants to know, given the identification of cyber threats as a top concern, will CAB be recommending the deployment of domain name system security extensions to member banks to help mitigate against the man-in-the-middle attacks where end-user credentials can be compromised. So I'm going to ask that again because I need to get a question myself. So given the identification of cyber threats as a top concern, will CAB be recommending the deployment of domain name system security extensions to member banks to help mitigate against man-in-the-middle attacks where end-user credentials can be compromised?
So, hi, Albert, and thank you for that question. Albert and I had an opportunity to discuss exactly that when we met at the CANTO conference in February in Cuba. And yes, we are very open to having ongoing dialogue so that we can explore and understand exactly what the implications and benefits are to our members. The CAB usually has an annual conference where we bring together thought leadership, where we bring together professionals and experts to speak on factors that are impacting the banking sector and ensuring that we give our members the best opportunity to safeguard their operations against these sorts of hacks and threats and so on. And so we would be more than happy, Albert, to have you perhaps do your own storytelling in terms of what exactly would be the benefits of your services, for example, to ensure that we are mitigating against any opportunity for persons who are seeking gaps in the systems to ensure that we remain safe and that we are keeping our customers safe by extension.
Thank you, Wendy. We have a question from, I'm going to go with Crystal first. Crystal Etienne. Crystal wants to know, do you foresee more members of the unbanked community seeking to join the banking community presently or post-COVID?
As a matter of fact, I do believe, given the realities with which a lot of persons will face, we will be seeing a spiked increase in persons seeking banking services. One of the things that we know is on the rise now is the applications that support transferring of funds, etc. And there had been significant talk about the relevance of the banking sector, the brick and mortar, what we know banking to be. I think this has heightened the realization that there is still a place for all players in the market. What we have known historically banking to be is relevant in today's environment. And we would have seen, for example, like I said, persons who would normally be paid cash, where the employer was not able to immediately access the cash because the banks have been closed. And it's not only, again, a global pandemic like this that brings these things to the fore, but certainly if we look at the examples coming out of the Bahamas, coming out of St. Martin, coming out of Dominica, where those countries would have been shut down because of the hurricanes, and these are natural disasters that we face every single year, with increasing destruction. The ability to transfer funds to persons so that they have access, they can pay online, they can swipe a card as opposed to walking around with a wad of cash, which is where we know the ECCB really has been trying to send a strong message that we need to move away from a cash-based environment to being able to swipe a card, to be able to do your transactions, doing business online. It definitely speaks to the fact that the unbanked will recognize that there is a need to coexist with the banking sector, even if in the most simplistic way. Again, innovation was bred through the COVID environment, where we would have seen a number of small businesses, emerging as a result. So for example, we would have seen the emergence of curbside pickup of groceries. Well, how do you pay for that if you have not been paid by your employer? The most simple way would have been simply to swipe a card or to be able to do a debit card transaction, right? And so there truly is a need to reassess and re-examine the relevance of banks in today's environment as an ongoing concern, and a very, very relevant one too.
Thank you for that, Wendy. You know, the reality is that the banking sector, as well as many other sectors, have essentially been upended, right? We're in the midst of this fourth industrial revolution. And when I sat and I thought about it a couple of weeks ago, I said, you know, before COVID, we were essentially in our first trimester. And now we're in the midst of COVID. We're like a clumsy adolescent trying to feel our way around and figure things out. So perhaps later on, if we have time, you can share with us what your thoughts are insofar as what banking would look like after the pandemic. Because a lot of things that we experience today are products of that, the third industrial revolution. For example, office, we go to the office, I'm at the office now, but that's a product of a past time.
Correct.
And in some cases, going back will be a retrograde step. So, perhaps you can share with us later on, if we had time, your views or your thoughts on what banking would look like after the pandemic. But I want to take a question from someone else in the audience who's had a question there for a little while now. And this is living at ultimatepotentials.com. And they thank you for your very informative overview. I thank you for that as well, because it has been quite excellent. And their first question is, what financial impact, if any, have you noticed due to employees working from home? And their second question is, what, if any, considerations have been made to install a permanent work from home workforce? So the first is, what financial impact, if any, have you noticed due to employees working from home? And what, if any, considerations have been made to install a permanent work from home workforce? Thank you.
Okay, so if I were to start with the first question, for the banking sector, there would have been a significant impact in working from home for their immediate staff. And that would be born out of the fact that, again, what would have been mentioned earlier, where the banks are seeing a significant reduction in business activity, that is, the ability to write loans the way that we've done in the past, but still maintaining our staff at optimal levels, that is the optimal pay level. There's been no pay reductions whatsoever. We would have seen the banks trying to mitigate and to stem the bleeding, so to speak, by managing work hours. So in a lot of instances now, the banks are trying to figure out, given that we have seen an adjustment in mindset from a consumer perspective, in that we are seeing less lines, we are seeing persons having migrated to the online banking channels, but there still must be heart in what banks do. And I say this from the perspective of, we know that there are still a number of persons who are challenged either from a literacy perspective in being able to manage their online transactions independently. In my past life, where I managed a branch, I would have said to staff on certain days when we really were pushing persons to adapt to the new normal of online transactions, rather than sitting behind the counter, let's stand in front of the counter so that we can engage our clients as they walk in and help them become comfortable with technology. Because sometimes we do have to hold hands with someone to get them comfortable before they can run. So there would have been those sorts of cost implications for the financial sector, where we continue to operate as though there is no change, but noting significant changes in the way that we work. We would have seen persons making personal sacrifices despite the circumstance of the economic scale down to still go in to do, regular tasks that must be done on the back end. Again, just to keep staff motivated, because that is also something that perhaps we don't speak about, but it needs to be spoken about, and perhaps this is a good forum to do so. The psychological shift of waking up every morning and having a set routine, get dressed, go to the office, complete task, and day, shifted overnight to, in a lot of instances, wake up in the morning and there's no one standing over you saying, okay, so where's my report? Where's the document? Here are my customers to serve. And there can be, for a lot of persons, a mental challenge, a psychological challenge in making the shift as quickly as we would have had to do so in response. So to answer the second part of the question, which was, can we adopt this as a permanent circumstance? I think, like everything else, we are still in a position of assessment. We have to continue to assess productivity, for example. Like everything else, change brings opportunity. And so in a case like this, where we are perhaps now able to determine if we are seeing less persons coming into the bank for simple transactions, and by that I mean deposit money, withdraw money, transfer between accounts, pay bills online, can we now recognize this as truly a shift in mindset of our consumers? If we can see this as a shift in mindset and a sustainable shift in mindset, can we utilize the resources that we now have in a different manner? Perhaps there's a greater opportunity to reinvent the product offerings that we have if we are able to recognize change patterns in our consumers. So I think at this stage, we are in a bit of a hold position. I'm very, very pleased. I'm honored actually to say that within my own small secretariat, I've commended my team on more occasions than one for having been able to make the shift, continue with the efforts that the CAB is responsible for in a different manner. We are very visible online. We have been doing the virtual training and so on. And so while we do recognize that change is coming, we also have to be mindful not to make the missteps of assuming that everyone is comfortable with it and can continue to operate at the optimal levels. And so we continue to, as bankers truly do, ensure that the checks and balances are in place before we make definitive decisions as to the way forward.
Thank you, Wendy. We have a number of operators, I'm sure, who've tuned in today. And I'm going to ask this question on behalf of them all, myself more so than anyone else. Can you share with us the role that you see us as operators playing in terms of supporting and facilitating the initiatives that are heavily dependent on technology as the banking sector, transitions or continues to provide service in a different form? Tell us what our role is. How have we been working with you? How has connectivity aided or hampered this development?
Fantastic question, Krista. Thank you for asking. I think there is absolutely a synergy between the operators and not only the banking sector, but certainly all of the operators, all of the business houses moving forward, particularly as we begin to adapt and adopt technology in a more holistic manner. As we see, for example, one of the things that I always said in the past, and this is a very live example, is I can get onto a call with you, but I may not be able to maintain video contact because we would have seen bandwidth issues. So the quality of the audio may not have been the greatest. The quality of the video recordings may not have been the greatest. In circumstances like these, in times like these, we recognize again the opportunities to work more holistically together. And I think this is where the opportunity exists for CANTO members and the banking sector, like I said before, to realize that we can actually coexist and establish symbiotic relationships where we truly do feed off each other, because the success of organizations such as mine, which are pan-Caribbean, we are interconnected across the islands. It means that our ability to efficiently and effectively manage the expectations of our members depends on our ability to stay connected and not physically connected. We don't know when next we will be able to physically see each other, but in forums such as these.
Again, thank you, Wendy, for that question. We have another question from the audience. And this question comes from RR. Thank you, Wendy. How does the correspondent banking relationships assist or otherwise our regional economic development?
The correspondent banking relationships is one that we have seen receive a lot of attention over the last 5 years now, actually. Our very ability to survive, to live, to trade outside of our own immediate environment is hinged on strong correspondent banking relationships. What we have seen over the past is with enhanced regulatory monitoring, for example, the ask of banks to remain compliant has grown exponentially. And as such, the face of banking has also changed, perhaps on the back end, more so than persons realize. The physical and financial responsibilities and requirements of banks to remain compliant in order to maintain those correspondent banking relationships has continued to grow, has continued to mushroom. It is a very necessary part of the business that we do, that we are able to trade with the US, with the Americas, with the European markets, and so on and so forth. And hence the reason why the whole question of correspondent banking relationships is a very critical one for the financial services sector of the region of the Caribbean. In this particular instance, what CAB has recognized is because of the relationship and the intensity of the relationship, the absolute necessity for our survival, we have continued to ensure that we are promoting every opportunity for our members to remain compliant, to remain trained, and to remain on top of the requirements that we must meet in order to strengthen correspondent banking relationships. As well, we have continued to explore opportunities to introduce new relationships to the market. As I think everyone on the call today is at least in some way or form aware of the challenges that we've continued to face from a loss of correspondent banking relationships issue. Again, it becomes more necessary that we remain agile and that we remain highly responsive in environments such as these, where we are able to recognize opportunities that we can bring to our members to ensure that we maintain relationships that allow us to continue to trade in order to survive.
Thank you, Wendy, for that excellent answer. I don't have any more questions from the group, but I, of course, have a couple more questions, and I don't think I have enough time to ask. So I want to talk to you a little bit about big data and its role in the banking customer's journey. So we know that for regulatory and insurance purposes, banks are required to keep a significant amount of data for quite some time. But the question is, have banks really embraced the opportunity to now take this data and translate it into information with meaningful insights? Do you believe that banks in the region have, in fact, been really utilizing all this data that they have stored to make the customer journey better, to give them a competitive advantage? Have we been using big data in the banks? And is there room for improvement? Thank you.
Let me answer that this way, Krista, by starting with, I am an HR professional by training. And so I will start by saying that there is always going to be room for improvement. As far as big data and data analysis is concerned, the CAB has also recognized that there's a tremendous opportunity for us to remain relevant in being able to host information. Not only from a banking perspective, but generally speaking, we do recognize that there is a tremendous opportunity for information accumulation and dissemination within the region. One of the hardest things to find is empirical data on anything, right? And so a starting point really has to be, where do we store all of this data? And that is one of the things that the CAB is hoping to undertake as part of our strategic objectives in the not too distant future. As far as recognizing the relevance and the need for data acquisition, data accumulation, dissemination, I think that the banks definitely have seen the need. Again, this is going to be a cost implication that banks must measure very carefully. That said, however, there is already evidence that the banks are using the information in a very strategic manner to be able to project as well as to nurture the needs of the clients. I am sure that most persons, if not all on the call today, would know that one of the conversations that you have when you go into your bank is, what are your financial goals? And that is one of the first steps that the banks will take in trying to ensure that we understand exactly what it is that you are planning for yourself, and how then do we tailor our product offerings to you to ensure that you are able to meet those goals within the time frame set for yourself, or that we're even able to stretch you a little bit more than you thought possible to get you to meeting your goals a lot sooner than you anticipated. And sometimes part of that conversation is an unpleasant, no, this does not meet what we discussed when we first met. And so be thankful when your bank says no, because more likely than not, they will set a plan in place with you to take you to that journey, like you rightly said, Krista, to ensure that you are able to meet the goals that you've set for yourself. So to answer the question in short, yes, there is a recognition for the ability to take in data, analyze the data, and ensure that we're offering the best possible solutions for you. And I think one of the examples that we can give right now that everyone would be aware of is the ECCB's digital currency. We do recognize a need to move from a cash-based society to a less cash, not cashless, less cash economy. But there are steps that have to be put in place to ensure that when we do roll out these sorts of initiatives, that it meets the needs of our members and it's as kink-free as it can be.
Thank you, Wendy. I appreciate that. So I'm going to go back to the question that I asked earlier. Can you tell us what banking will look like after this pandemic? And I want to place specific focus on our indigenous banks in small island developing states in particular, as opposed to those in the more prosperous jurisdictions. What's the outlook in the post, if one exists, post-COVID period, but taking into consideration this and embracing this fourth industrial revolution that we're all privileged to be a part of?
Mm-hmm. Again, like we've said, Crystal, on this during our discussion, there's tremendous opportunity to be had from this whole COVID environment. I suppose it's mindset that's going to determine whether you adopt a winning mindset through this challenge, or whether or not you determine that you will have a defeatist attitude. I think that if we were to start from the top, I would say that the ECCB has done an absolutely fantastic job in ensuring that we are well capitalized as a region, and that we are managing the capitalization in a very, very prudential way. So as it stands now, there is still a lot of uncertainty and a lot of difficulty in being able to predict exactly where we will end. Because like you rightly said, is there such a thing as a post-COVID environment, or do we now have to learn to live with COVID? In terms of being able to ensure that we remain profitable and relevant entities who can meet the needs of our public, the banks are going to have to take a very, very strategic review of portfolios. What is the damage going to be from a lot of the layoffs that we've already seen happening, for example, in the tourism sector? What is it going to mean from a non-performing perspective for the banking industry? And like you rightly said, our indigenous banks perhaps do not have the deep pockets that our international banks would have had when they were present, or for those who remain present in today's market. That said, however, I think that the banks being able to come forth and say, let's do a 3 to 6 month moratorium, speaks to the fact that we are fully aware of the challenges that we are going to face if this becomes a long-term challenge in terms of being able to manage it. Another thing is from a cost management perspective, the ability now to recognize that perhaps we can allow persons to work from home in an effort to manage costs effectively, as opposed to having everyone consistently coming into office, rotating hours. In some instances, we've actually seen where branches opening hours are being rotated depending on the number of branches present in an island. So the banks are taking a very critical role. I think this is where being able to test the business continuity plans have really come into place. The banks have proven their agility. So I think that what we will see coming out of this is a stronger, more resilient, far more agile banking sector than we thought possible. And again, kudos to our banking sector with no bias whatsoever for being in a position to respond as efficiently as they have during this unprecedented time.
Thank you very much for that, Wendy. So folks, today we have had the honor and the privilege of chatting with Ms. Wendy Delmar, the CEO of the Caribbean Association of Banks. And we at CANTO do in fact look forward to a continued relationship with you, your secretariat, and the wider banking society in the region, because we do recognize that as we forge ahead in these unprecedented times, we all have the opportunity to shape what the future looks like, and we can do that the best way by working together. So I hope that our participants did in fact enjoy today's episode. I can tell you that I did quite a bit. Thank you, Wendy, for chatting with us. And if you did, I encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube channel at the handle CANTO Caribbean. Remember that our next webinar will be on Thursday, May 28th at 11 a.m. Please join the conversation when we discuss the future of the Caribbean's payment system and banking post-COVID-19 central bank digital currencies. Our guest speaker for that session will be Ms. Sybil Welch, Senior Project Specialist of the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank. And for those of you who may not have had the opportunity to have your questions answered today, perhaps you can have it answered then. So thank you, and until then, stay home, stay safe, stay connected, stay banking, and enjoy us. Look forward to our next CANTO conversations. Have a good one, folks.
Thanks, everyone.